Hello, everyone. So today we're going to continue our analysis of Chapin and his claims and his ideas. And today we're going to explore two videos, or maybe it's just one video in a quarter or something, because the second video, both are very short, by the way, but the second video only takes like a 30-second clip out of it. I will be using Chapin's video, a clip from one of his videos. He said that, if I do that, he was making a big deal about how that's against YouTube's terms and conditions. I don't care if he takes any content from my videos and clips it in to respond to one of my videos or one of my points. Doesn't matter to me, and hopefully he'll respond in kind. So yes, this video will use clips from Chapin's videos. And so here goes. Now, these two clips in particular, I think, highlight Chapin's misunderstanding and downright ignorance of where things like socialism stem from, why it pertains to human tribalism and evolutionary psychology. And so I'm going to play for you that video right now that I think highlights his misunderstanding of these factors that go into socialism as we know it today. And then I'm going to comment on it. So here's the video, and both of these videos are going to be in the description box if you want to watch them all on your own.
Welcome to Chapin's Inferno, a wandering cauldron of politically incorrect commentary. I wanted to talk today about an argument that's really going around the manosphere that I've seen a lot of times. It's a very poor argument, but people are starting to repeat it now. And the argument is that socialism is biological. Inherent to all human beings, we become socialistic. That's why we have all these governments. There are tons of logical leaps in that statement, lots of lazy thinking, but really it comes down to two things. One, it's an appeal to sophistication. Like, you sound like you're above all this stuff, which people really seem to like on the internet. I don't know why. They just love appeals to sophistication. The second part of it is shut up. Stop talking. Socialism's just going to be there. There's nothing we can do. Let's move along now. Let's stop talking. What time is it? I've got some games to play. No, that's not right. Because, yes, people have always banded together for the purposes of self-defense. That's true. That's not a lie. But they haven't always banded together to run Ponzi welfare schemes or social security schemes and to run things like housing and urban development and the Department of Labor and to give agricultural subsidies and to have secretaries making 90 grand a year and having, I don't know how many days, 40 days off a year, So, no, they're two different issues. If you're going to have self-defense, if you say people band together for self-defense, that is true. And that has happened since the dawn of man. But all this recent stuff, this 20th century stuff, is not, by the fact that it's 20th century stuff tells you that it's not inherent to human beings that we're going to have, are intrinsic to our species, that we have to have all these socialist empires set up and bureaucracies. And I think that's it's a very poor argument, and I wanted to get it out of the way because I've been hearing it more and more. And it's also a United States or a UK-centric argument, because there are other countries in the world, like the often mentioned, often loved Sweden, which the left just loves Sweden, that had free market reforms in the 1990s that have allowed them to remain prosperous. But of course, they're not doing as well as Norway, and they won't do as well as Norway in the future, which is another story in itself. But so even as we are going broke with our socialism in this country, there are other countries that are waking up and doing it right. So I think it's just going to be an ebb and flow, and I think it's an ebb and flow due to a lack of education. I don't think it's going to be an endpoint. I think that Williamson may have been right about one thing when he said that the end is coming and it's going to be great, where he thinks there's going to be a decline in all these social welfare programs and this social welfare state. If we can get back to a 10% taxation state, I'd be much happier, and I think most people in America want to be able to work and to keep most of what they earn. So just because you band together for self-defense does not mean that we have to have a $4 trillion government on top of all the state and local governments. I just want to get that out of the way. It's been bothering me for a couple of weeks. See you soon.
Okay, let's comment on this here. Now, while it's true that people have always banded together for self-defense, that is only a small part of the story. Right? People have always banded together for self-defense. They've also always banded together for communal resource aggregation. All right, this stressing of self-defense, and you can see it in the way he's talking, really is just a segue into his justification for a nationalized socialist military force. He has to make sure that that is somehow related intrinsically towards human nature and an intrinsic need that human beings have, so that he can justify the statism that's required to fund a military of that size, and a military in general that's taxpayer funded. So with that said, right, our species, shortly after the development of agriculture, they found out that it was easier, as opposed to a nomadic tribal existence, to band together around resource-rich areas and get to work stockpiling resources. And our first city-states emerged via this process, and our first grain repositories emerged from this process, all the way up to and including our modern-day grain repository, and, that's a supermarket or a grocery store that's peppered throughout Western civilization, all the way from the tiniest hamlet to the largest cities. This, in fact, is reflective of our socialist instinct and our tribal instinct. This is why serfs, for example, were willing to endure what was essentially slavery to a king, so long as he kept relative peace and order in a society, even if he was taking the lion's share of the crops and wealth for himself. Now, what's interesting, right, and what Chapin doesn't understand, is that the king in question had to, if he wanted to remain in power, provide the most amount of stability, while, of course, wishing to take the most amount of wealth. But he was, make no mistake about it, he was offering a service. The peasants wanted the best master that they could get, and now were the peasants in bondage? Well, sure they were. And did they like that they were in bondage? Almost certainly not. And what did they often do after revolting against a king who had allowed conditions to get so bad that they couldn't withstand his rule any longer? Well, a lot of times they would search for a new king, right? It took a very long time before we as a people, as a species, started asking ourselves how we could structure a civilization without kings, and instead with democratic rule that is for and by the people. The psychological barrier that these peasants had to overcome was one of the fear of instability, the fear of striking out on their own and then being responsible for their own yearly crop yield and fighting off rival tribes and kings and keeping relative stability in their respective areas. And this is the same psychological barrier that stops a potential entrepreneur from starting his own business. It's the fear of being alone and on your own, financially speaking, knowing that you're responsible and completely responsible for the success or failure of your economic future. And this is what informs socialism. It's fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of uncertainty. And this same fear can drive capitalistic tendencies as well. Because remember, all of this fear just stems from our ability to, as sentient apes, to visualize the future and visualize our place in that future. And the fear of not having the resources that we need to survive is a very potent motivator. So again, the same fear can drive capitalistic tendencies as well. I mean, what is capitalism other than a positive exploitation of human greed and fear? Why does the capitalist innovate? Why does he work 18 hours if he knows his competition works 17? Why does he do that? Why do you see people who, upon entering into capitalist economies, sometimes with nothing and dirt broke and dirt poor, who eventually rise up to dominate in their business ventures and become wealthy captains of industry or business magnates? It's the fear of going back to poverty. It's the fear of going back to poverty. It's the lust for wealth, which, when you really look at it, are just one and the same. It's about resource acquisition and survival. Everything can be explained through human nature. Everything can be explained through the will to survive as human animals. So things like government, things like business and capitalism and socialism, these are all simply survival strategies. And these survival strategies can be exploited. They can be exploited to oppress. They can be exploited to repress. They can be exploited to prosper. So the actual argument, instead of what Chapin puts forth, the actual argument being made is that humans are both, not only, but both naturally socialistic and naturally capitalistic, with of course some human beings gravitating towards either end of that spectrum depending on their natural proclivities. Again, we explain human behavior not with political isms, but with an analysis of human ecology. Now, at this point, Chapin will usually mock this and say, well, it's an attempt by pretentious MGTOW, right, to avoid political discourse. And he would be right. Other than the fact that it's not pretentious, yes, it is an attempt to avoid political discourse. We wish to transcend politics by connecting it to wider phenomena and explaining it with wider phenomena. It's not really avoiding it, it's just rising above it and explaining it in more simplistic terms that also manage to define and explain the complexities in a better fashion. And people like Chapin, he said it many times, he believes this to be done to project a false image of sophistication. The reason MGTOW actually do it, however, is because they are attempting to develop a unified theory of the human animal. We don't ignore politics, we explain its causes. And because these causes lie outside of the vernacular of mainstream left-right politics, people like Chapin, they can no longer group MGTOW. He can't typecast MGTOW, he can't pigeonhole MGTOW, and Chapin has developed a pretty robust, if you've been paying attention, Chapin has developed a pretty robust system of tactics designed to keep the conversation focused on the narrow spectrum of politics since his entire, and I really mean the entirety of tools in his toolbox of argumentation, needs necessarily to rely on placing you in some group so that he can dismiss you based on that group affiliation before the argument gets too close to him having to acknowledge that the political totality of human beings do not fit into neat little categories of right and left. It's really silly when you really analyze it, the way he rigidly places people in right and left this way. And sometimes it just boggles the mind because he's been getting away with this all along and nobody seems to have called him out on it. That's essentially what he's been doing throughout this whole time. Not actually delving into what causes things like leftism, but categorizing like some non-thinking political sorting machine, categorizing everyone he comes across into a rigid group with defined boundaries so that people, for fear of ostracization from his little clique, and for fear of being branded a leftist, either self-censor or double-think themselves into adopting his ideological virus. And this, if you've been paying attention, is why he accuses so thoroughly, quote, leftists of never putting their positions on the table. That's one of his favorite phrases. You see, it's not enough to simply debunk his claim and that's that. No, you see, according to him, you have to lay all of your positions and opinions bare on a myriad of other subjects first. So if he starts panicking, and if it starts to look like the shoddy superstructure he's built on a sand bank is about to collapse, he can then divert the conversation back to guilt by association, and in other words, smear you by calling you a leftist. In fact, this type of argumentation, where you don't have to give your memoirs and your position on everything in life before you debunk a point, is, according to him, right, a classic tactic of leftist Alinskyites or some other such bullshit. It doesn't matter that it's a sound method of argumentation, right? We don't ask a physicist to lay out his ideas on biological theories of evolution or panspermia or something like that. We don't ask him to do that before he attempts to falsify one of his physicist colleagues' experiments. Right? This is the scientific method, based on falsifiability. Science, and thus human discovery itself, would quite literally come to a standstill if we adopted this process of thought, and we should not adopt it when discussing political ideas either. For me to disagree on whether or not the right is this or whether or not the right is that shouldn't mean that I have to give you a resume, a veritable resume, a cornucopia of my political opinions on every possible political issue at hand. It's designed to foster guilt by association, ostracization practices, just like our friends the feminists do. So I think that Bernard has to listen, right, and listen good, and realize that at no point were MGTOW arguing, or myself was arguing, that because we've gravitated towards socialism in our distant past, and because it's part of our nature, that this means that we must have overinflated government and secretaries that make 90 grand a year. The point that we were making is that this is the method by which government achieves this. Doesn't matter if we should or shouldn't have, or if we can justify it. This is how government gets it done. It's the same exact reason Best Buy makes millions off of warranty policies that almost never wind up in claim, because it provides the consumer with peace of mind, and Best Buy exploits this. And governments exploit citizens in the same way, by tapping into this instinct of fear and exploiting it so that the people acquiesce. Even if the people know that they're getting shafted. It's really just like the peasantry, who know the king is taking the lion's share of the resources and still prefer that to venturing out on their own. And you can sit there and get on your high horse and say all this nonsense about all we have to do is change people and evangelize about freedom and libertarianism. But the fact is that the human animal doesn't always choose competition, and the human animal doesn't always choose capitalism, And sometimes, yes, they just want to be taken care of. And like I said before, the people that are incapable of competing in cutthroat capitalist environments are the ones that will gravitate towards this socialist model of being taken care of. It's a survival strategy, and you will not get people to part ways for your libertarian delusion and your libertarian mission. You will not get people to part ways with the manifestation of their survivalist instincts. And then Chapin says, and this really highlights his misunderstanding of these things, he says that these phenomena can't be inherent to human beings because it's, quote, 20th century stuff. And of course, this indicates to me, Chapin, that you have a very incomplete idea of what exactly human nature really is. And perhaps this is also why you don't understand its role in economics and in politics and government. The 20th century didn't roll along and all of a sudden our natures just magically change. Human nature hasn't changed at any period in civilization. We have essentially the same predispositions and evolutionary psychology we had at the dawn of civilization. Social media is, quote, 20th century stuff. And yet, look at the way we've built social networks within social media, right? Facebook and Instagram and the like. All of this has its basis in our species' origins and in our species' nature. And this is why, for example, futurologists can predict with what seems like prescient accuracy, to the point that it's spooky, what might happen 50 years into the future, given that they account for enough variables in our current society. We're talking about people like Aldous Huxley. Look to the book Stand on Zanzibar in the description box for an example of this as well. But, so briefly going back to the government issue. One of my favorite capitalists is the co-founder of PayPal, and that's billionaire Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel happens to be responsible for, I love this, for this little gem of commentary here. He says, quote, "Since 1920, the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women, two constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron," end quote. Now, I love that little quote because people like Peter Thiel know what's actually going on. Sure, limited government is great, but once you extend the vote to women, things start changing fast, and it's not the Marxists who did it. It's actually the people in Western civilizations who voted for women's suffrage, who ratified women's suffrage. You see, real capitalists, actual tested and proven self-made billionaires, don't look at economics as much as they understand people. People drive economies, not vice versa. And to understand people is to understand their spending habits and how their voting habits will affect your profits as a venture capitalist and your bottom line. And the man, Peter Thiel, seems to have an excellent grasp on the relationship between the state and capitalism in his article titled, quote, "Competition is for losers." And in this article, I'm going to read it to you. Bear with me. It's a little long, but we'll get through it here. He says, quote, "What valuable company is nobody building? This question is harder than it looks because your company could create a lot of value without becoming very valuable itself. Creating value isn't enough. You also need to capture some of the value you create. This means that even very big businesses can be bad businesses. For example, US airline companies serve millions of passengers and create hundreds of billions of dollars of value each year. But in 2012, when the average airfare each way was $178 USD, the airlines made only 37 cents per passenger trip. Compare them to Google, which creates less value but captures far more. The airlines compete with each other, but Google stands alone. Economists use two simplified models to explain the difference: perfect competition and monopoly. And he says, quote, "Perfect competition is considered both the ideal and default state in Economics 101. So-called perfectly competitive markets achieve equilibrium when producer supply meets consumer demand. Every firm in a competitive market is undifferentiated and sells the same homogeneous products. Since no firm has any market power, they must all sell at whatever price the market determines. If there is money to be made, new firms will enter the market, increase supply, drive prices down, and thereby eliminate the profits that attracted them in the first place. If too many firms enter the market, they'll suffer losses. Some will fold and prices will rise back to sustainable levels. Under perfect competition, in the long run, no company makes an economic profit. The opposite of perfect competition is monopoly. Whereas a competitive firm must sell at the market price, a monopoly owns its market. so it can set its own prices. Since it has no competition, it produces at the quantity and price combination that maximizes its profits. To an economist, every monopoly looks the same, whether it deviously eliminates its rivals, secures a license from the state, or innovates its way to the top. Now, I'm not interested in illegal bullies or government favorites. By monopoly, I mean the kind of company that is so good at what it does that no other firm can offer a close substitute. Google is a good example of a company that went from 0 to 1. It hasn't competed in search since the early 2000s when it definitively distanced itself from Microsoft and Yahoo. Americans mythologize competition and credit it with saving us from socialist breadlines. Actually, capitalism and competition are opposites. Capitalism is premised on the accumulation of capital, but under perfect competition, all profits get competed away. The lesson for entrepreneurs is clear. If you want to create and capture lasting value, don't build an undifferentiated commodity business. How much of the world is actually monopolistic? How much is truly competitive? It is hard to say because our common conversation about these matters is so confused. To the outside observer, all businesses can seem reasonably alike, so it is easy to perceive only small differences between them. But the reality is much more binary than that. There is an enormous difference between perfect competition and monopoly, and most businesses are much closer to one extreme than we commonly realize. The confusion comes from a universal bias for describing market conditions in self-serving ways. Both monopolists and competitors are incentivized to bend the truth. Monopolists lie to protect themselves. They know that bragging about their great monopoly invites being audited, scrutinized, and attacked. Since they very much want their monopoly profits to continue unmolested, they tend to do whatever they can to conceal their monopoly, usually by exaggerating the power of their non-existent competition. Now you see, I gotta give Peter Thiel credit, because he actually tells us something in this article that most capitalists will never admit but know intrinsically. And that is that the true capitalist wants to eliminate competition, not engage in it. The true capitalist wants to monopolize. He wants to manufacture goods on the cheap, he wants to pay his workers shit for doing it, and he wants to make a killing off of an overpriced product. Peter Thiel is the real deal. He's a venture capitalist, self-made billionaire. And I believe he knows that the state isn't the only oppressor there is by a long shot. Unfettered capitalism can be good and prosperous, and it can be cold and exploitative. Right? You load 16 tons and what do you get? You remember that song? What's the last part of it again? St. Peter, don't you call me 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. Now, if you understand the fear behind that statement, you'll start to understand why the state itself exists. So again, in talking about fear and how this basic instinct drives the capitalist and socialist human predisposition, I believe that the manifestation of human beings' socialist tendencies are the state. I believe that a government is a natural human phenomenon created to mitigate human fear. I think people naturally understand that although capitalism can be a great thing and can generate prodigious wealth, people know on some level that runaway capitalism, or perhaps the better term is unfettered capitalism, can quickly descend into a situation of financial oligarchs who see human beings as nothing but livestock for their profit and who are willing to put them in all sorts of dangerous and uncomfortable situations for their profit. People don't want to work in asbestos. People know that asbestos gear is expensive. People know that their shady boss might not care about exposing his workers to this. And so people lobby the government to create OSHA as a means of guarding against these things. Now, of course, it's not quite that simple, but you see the point that I'm getting at here. But now to wrap things up, I want to illustrate this with a clip from one of Chapin's other videos, right? And this video was titled, "Statism is Human Nature, LOL," where he attempts to debunk my claim that governments tend to consistently grow perpetually. So let's listen in here.
The guy says all these governments just keep growing and growing and never stops. What happened with the Soviet Union? Does Russia have the same size government in percentage to the state that it had in 1987? Of course not. What even about China, which hasn't had any type of revolution, that has technically the same government? Now they have a much smaller, or they have a much bigger private sector that dwarfs the size of the state. It is completely, I mean, it hasn't changed on paper, but you have a lot of people in China that are making and doing lots of things that they were not doing before under the state is everything system. So in every situation, and governments don't just, it's not throughout the course of human history that one government gets bigger and bigger. A lot of times you have a situation like Yugoslavia, where at one point you had one huge government, And now you've got all these different states that are much happier not having to live together, or at least without a powerful thumb over them. And you may see Iraq go in that direction too. You may see 3 states in Iraq. You may see our government stopping them from taking over the Kurds, and that'll be about it. Then you'll have an Islamic State, and then you'll have Syria, and then you have all that. So no, the direction is not always in bigger government. And there's nothing about human nature that says that we're going to give up our freedom to some central authority. People banded together in tribes to try to promote safety, protection, not so they could have social security programs or Medicare or anything like that. So it's just stupid. We do not advance towards socialism. And I don't know, you just have to have some sort of knowledge of history, which this guy...
Okay, so here, Chapin inadvertently makes my point for me. He gives the Soviet Union as an example to disprove my point that the government tends towards perpetual growth and largesse. And, really this is a silly attempt to disprove my hypothesis because, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Nations can and do overextend themselves. They can and do dissolve and break apart. But the general trend, everybody knows this, the general trend of growth of the state is reflected throughout human history, right? Since the advent of the state. The state grabs hold of power, it will want to keep that power. It will want to keep that power by justifying its existence, and it will usually justify that existence via a mixture of legitimacy, that is providing defense, infrastructure, things that are indispensable, and then it will also do it by justifying existence via veiled parasitism. This is the line that most governments have to walk, and this is the line that the citizenry of a government walks right along with them. It's a tightrope. Government is in this constant dance between satiating the people by supplying either real or imagined goods or services that the people demand, and also amassing wealth and resources for its continued existence. Now, in this video, Chapin mentions China and their embracing of free market practices and how it's evidence of the economy taking off when less government is present. But the irony in saying this is that China's move towards less government interference is actually one of the best arguments for the justification of a state. Now take a look at China, and particularly Beijing in satellite images, and what do you see? I'll tell you what you see. You see a wall, a literal jet stream wall of smog. Beijing in particular is in desperate need of some kind of state-mandated environmental regulation. They have so many benzines and chemicals and toxic runoff in their water that if you throw a cigarette in a river, that river may just catch on fire, and that's happened before. People who have never smoked are getting lung cancer and birth defects are exploding. And I'll have links that you can peruse yourself at your leisure in regards to this. Right? So cancer rates are exploding, water is polluted, air quality is horrendous, but at least you got your free market, right? You see, it's only a matter of time before the citizens of China start demanding that the government regulate air quality and water quality. And this, gentlemen, is a manifestation of the fear I just talked about. The fear that people have of being commoditized by industry that's often just as powerful, if not stronger, than their fear of being commoditized by the state. And gentlemen, that's all I have to say for now, but stay tuned, gentlemen, more to come. Again, thanks for listening. If any of you guys want to send me an email, barbarossa930@gmail.com with only 2 A's.